This is the 5-minute guide to the South Dakota class battleships of the United States Navy. But haven't we already done this, I hear you ask? No, not quite. Before the South Dakota class of World War II there was the South Dakota class of the 1920s. The first South Dakota class were the last battleships authorized under the Naval Act of 1916, a law which marked the American Congress finally agreeing to actually give the Navy some money instead of sending the admirals looking down the backs of their sofas for spare change. Prior to these vessels, the United States Navy had spent the better part of a decade constructing various classes of so-called standard battleships, with broadly common performance and firepower characteristics designed to allow them to operate better as a fleet in battle. This standardization was especially necessary as the previous lack of funds meant most classes only ever got a couple of ships built, whereas Britain, Germany and even France were building classes of 4 or more ships, allowing a single class of vessel to act as its own homogeneous battle squadron. However, this approach had meant that as the 1910s turned into the 1920s, the Americans were at risk of being left behind in certain fields. The South Dakota class was designed to correct this, and did so in a spectacular way. Here you can see a chart of some key battleship characteristics for the United States Navy. Notice the sharp spike in pretty much every value. The speed increase might not seem much but was critical. The standard class traveled at 21 knots, but both the British and Japanese fleets, the most likely rivals going forward, had average fleet speed slightly above this. As a result, in a hypothetical sea battle, an enemy fleet would be able to withdraw if the battle went badly, or they didn't like the odds to start with, and the Americans would not be able to catch them. Conversely, if the battle looked to be going badly for the Americans, the 21-knot maximum speed was insufficient to allow them to retreat. The change to 23 knots negated most of this issue. Additionally, whereas previous classes had increased displacement by perhaps a couple of thousand tons, these ships would be nearly 10,000 tons heavier. This made room for the bigger engines, the deck armor being increased to almost twice the thickness, and the change from the Colorado's 8 16-inch guns to 12 16-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, a pair super firing forward, and another pair super firing at the rear. The guns were also 50 caliber instead of 45 caliber, so, although they used the same shells, they could fire further and hit harder. The 5-inch gun that was almost universal in the United States Navy was abandoned for 16 6-inch guns as a secondary battery alongside 4 3-inch dual-purpose guns, some saluting guns and a pair of torpedo tubes. All things considered, the ships had considerable firepower, well in excess of anything that had come before them in any nation. However, a few features carried over from the standard class. The lattice masts and other superstructure element were practically identical. The use of turboelectric propulsion for the engines and the same thickness of belt armor as per previous ships was retained. These could have presented some issues. The lattice masts were a known problem and could have been fairly easily replaced as they were with other ships. The turboelectric propulsion offered a number of advantages in efficiency, subdivision against torpedo impact and the ability to apply full power in reverse. However, the equipment was heavier and bulkier than normal turbine propulsion, and insulation of all the electrical parts was inadequate. This was bad enough in peacetime on other ships, and needless to say, in the event of battle damage, extremely large amounts of electrical current and water do not mix well for anyone in the area, especially if your ship is made of metal. But perhaps the greatest flaw was the belt armor. Despite the increase in the size of enemy and their own guns, this thickness had not been increased since before the First World War. And whilst these ships were absolute beasts compared to all previous American battleship designs, they were not designed in isolation. At the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, all 6 ships were under construction, but the limit on displacement to 35,000 tons meant they would all be scrapped. This also applied to British and Japanese battleships currently under construction or about to be ordered. Here is a quick comparison of the contemporary battleship designs: the South Dakota for America, the N3 for Britain and the Tosa for Japan. I will also include the British G3 class battle cruisers, since these were so powerfully designed they would be battleships in almost any consideration. Whilst looking at this though, it must be remembered that the Americans were planning on building 6 of their ships whilst the other powers were only going to build 4 of each of theirs. The 6 ships were going to be named as follows: South Dakota, Indiana, Montana, North Carolina, Iowa and Massachusetts. As those of you familiar with warship history will recognize, 5 of these names eventually made it into service, with 3 of them, North Carolina, South Dakota and Iowa, becoming the lead ships, and therefore named ships of the next 3 classes of American battleships. Unfortunately, the USS Montana next resurfaced as the lead ship of the Montana class, which were in many ways similar to the 1920s South Dakota design, only bigger and better. And of course that class was also cancelled. The name Montana seems to be cursed in the United States Navy, first used on an armored cruiser. Both attempts to use the name for a battleship were curtailed by that ship's cancellation. As a result, since the First World War there has not been any ship with this name in the United States Navy, although a Virginia-class nuclear submarine due for completion in 2020 is due to carry the name. Over 100 years since the last holder went out of service. With the ship's cancellation, the main guns were sent to coastal defense batteries and the secondary guns were installed on the Omaha-class scout cruisers and a number of large submarines. The main guns almost ended up in the Iowa-class battleships in World War II, but due to a miscommunication the ships were not designed to take turrets big enough and a lighter gun of the same caliber and length had to be designed from scratch. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below.